Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Economan at YouTube with another airbrush review. The Badger Sotar 0.2mm. This was acquired via Airbrush Supplies USA. It is an American manufactured airbrush and acquired at cost during a huge promotion. As I've acquired this airbrush via unusual circumstances, this is not the typical retail packaging. It does have a much fancier box and way of being displayed, though it is a very high-end and one of the more expensive and finer airbrushes, being a completely different model and way around from our usual Hyacinth, Olympus or Iwata fashion of airbrush. The parts are completely different and not compatible with anything else we've seen before. Now, going back to Airbrush USA, they do full servicing of every single component you need: seals, nozzles, needles, all that sort of thing. But through careful use and applying it to strategic certain jobs, you're not going to find a lot of damage and you won't need to update it. It's ideal to have something cheaper as a workhorse. Secondly, a bit of a advanced notice: my airbrushing methods, maintenance and application is completely different to the norm in the way of lubrication, application, cleaning. This style may not necessarily work for everyone. However, it is not going to do any damage to your brush or the output on your models. Make sure you do sufficient tests. Straight into the unboxing. Normally when you buy these, it comes with an adapter. It's got a very strange input and it converts it to a 1/8 thread to fit in most, if not all, hoses and air compressors. A bit of a warning to seat your needle and spray water. I've already done that as a test, but we're going to do a full comprehensive setup. This has come straight out of the actual Badger factory with the instructions, and they're fairly crude cutout, which isn't a big deal. The airbrush itself is what's important. The Sotar 2020 warranty, certificate of authenticity and parts list. It's very important to keep this for reference, and a few bits of advice in operating, as well as nice little card. Now this is the important piece. We've got our wrench for the front bit, and the airbrush itself is a powder coated steel with a rubber bit at the end. Does not have a traditional cup, and the needle is sticking out the back. Ergonomically does fit in the hand quite nicely. So the first thing we're going to do is pull it apart, put it back together and get used to it. Just a bit of a play. There's very restrictive pull back going backwards, and we'll see why that is the case, as well as the part does fit on the bottom there. This bit is plastic just for finger resting, but it comes off. It is very tempting to use an airbrush straight out of the box and have fun with it, but it is important to know the internals in repairing and cleaning it. The safest way in getting familiar with the airbrush is pulling it apart from the back and moving our way down. So we're going to release the needle nut and pull it out as so we don't damage it. This and the nozzle is the most important piece. The nozzle here is protruding outside of the crown, but it is very thick, a lot like the one from the Ophir. So damage is not common, though it can still split. Thus why care is definitely needed. We're going to take the back off. The needle nut we make sure we never lose, and it is available through the cutout here. All this part does is control the rocking of the trigger. There is very little here we can actually maintain. The rest is the internals. So this part here is the assembly of the trigger. It has a very long thread, and the best thing about long threads, besides the fact that it does take a while to pull apart, is there's less likely chance for air and paint leaks. So there we go, we've got our assembly here. Now what's very clever with this bit is the spring is inside and protected by a circular nut here, so you're not suddenly going to be losing parts all over the place. The trigger comes out, and the tongue is surprisingly super easy and quick to put in and out. We've got a T shape, there's not much else inside. There's not a lot of option to pull apart the solenoid, but as long as we don't allow paint in, it should be perfectly fine. Going straight for the trigger, when we just want to take a little bit of debris out of the hollow before the nozzle, we can pull this apart. It uses a Teflon O-ring. Do not lose this, or otherwise you're going to have air escaping into the cup and causing bubbles. It goes together and pulls apart very, very nicely, as it has an internal thread unlike an external thread. Quite well designed, bit of a surprise. You can take this little plate off to expose the nozzle, though I would recommend not doing that unless absolutely necessary. This thing is fully capable of taking thinner baths, but I wouldn't do it too often, as everything is quite open and wide, and it's very easy to access almost everything. When cleaning, a smaller Q-tip is able to access everything, and there's a huge opening in clearing out any sort of debris. We have some petroleum jelly, a Q-tip, and this is the trigger assembly. The part is most likely that's going to get sticky and cause us problems. What we're going to do is pinch this little hollow nut, open it up, again a long thread, and you'll see the spring pops out quite easily. With our finer Q-tip, or a normal Q-tip, we're going to just lightly grease up the internal, and while we're at it, we'll glaze up the thread to make sure nothing's going to make that unnecessarily tight. Pop back the spring, close it, and we might not have to do this on very rare occasions. Now we've got the part here. There is a D cutout, goes together, and once it's in the correct orientation, it has quite a bit of resistance. So going to again pinch the thread, and just because of the tight tolerance of this airbrush opposed to things like our Ophias and our Hyacinths, we only lightly glaze the surface and do not leave much of a build up at all. And this way it's just going to glide ever so smoother. You can get high velocity oils that you can also glaze the metals with, and they work quite well. It's up to what you decide to use. They're not really anything special, they're just a water-based high velocity lubricant. Now we have the body itself, and we've just only got the Q-tip glazed again. No build-up of petroleum jelly whatsoever, and we're just glazing the inside of the thread just so we're not going to over tighten. You can see that the Q-tip is darkening as they've put their own lubricant in there previously. I like to just use my own thing. I think it's a bit too light and doesn't meet my needs. So we've just glazed everything just right. And to put it all back together, we have the trigger. We're going to make sure the hole is facing the direction of the nozzle so the needle can go straight through. And there's just the slightest amount of resistance pushing it up and down. This body piece I would not soak in thinner. The other bits I would, the nozzle and the assembly, because the air solenoid here is very, very fine. If I never have to open that, that would be absolutely perfect. Now, the tongue here is going to sit inside the body like that. And we've got a T-piece. It beautifully just slides straight in, sits there, and you want it to just move forward to hug the side of the trigger. Now we get the assembly and we just screw that in all the way until we get resistance and it stops. There is quite a bit of thread, and if your internals are plugged in properly, and when you pull that you should see the tongue just shudder backwards and forwards, and it swings backwards and forwards with no resistance whatsoever. If there's any resistance or the tongue gets stuck halfway up, it means that it has not been assembled correctly with the trigger assembly. Next step, we put the nozzle assembly. There's not much you have to do. Just finger tight, that's it. The needle knot, ever so slightly. The body goes over. The stopper just slightly open. Close the body, tighten that slightly, and then the needle goes all the way through. If you want to, you can actually glaze the needle a bit. It does have quite a convenient finger handle, just about halfway from the back. And we shall glide this all the way through the body. If there's any resistance, you do not push forward. Push down the trigger if you have to. There is going to be an O-ring, so it's going to slow down and get a bit tighter, but it should not stop. And then we keep pushing until we see the needle just sitting right through the nozzle. We close the needle nut and we adjust. You don't want to have the needle nut too tight. If it's overly tight, the tongue is going to get stuck. So tighten the needle nut, test it. If it gets stuck, just keep slightly opening it until it flows quite nicely like this. You want the trigger to only go back about half the way, not all the way. So it'll hit the T section and it's pretty much going to fall apart as you're operating. Once you're done, we put the cap on as such and wipe it down with a tissue, wash our hands. We've got our adapter screwed in at the bottom of the airbrush. It does have some sort of resistor or flow restrainer, so the air pressure coming out is always consistent and on the lower end, which is quite nice. I suggest putting a water filter, not trap, at the very bottom. They're very cheap to come across. We shall do a seal test. So pushing down, we've got no bubbles appearing, meaning the seal is pretty good. Just finger tight, pull back, you push forward. The trigger is a bit sticky. It does take a while to shut off. I found this to be at factory fresh and after maintenance. It is just a function. pull the trigger all the way back and release all the thinner to clean it out nicely. It is important to have your paint thinned to the milk of consistency, or 1:1, as it will jam or clog quite easily. Then apply just a very little amount into the cup. We're going to do our spray test, and we're just rocking back ever so tiny, and it gives us a really fine line. We'll just rock it back even less, and we'll get nice and close, and we're given a line as fine as something you'll do with a pencil. Rock it all the way back. The gradient is finish, not the best, but it's not necessarily a airbrush that you colour in with. The handling of this airbrush is a little different to anything I'm used to, so the lines are far from perfect in the way of being straight and turning them on and off. It is a very fiddly airbrush and a bit tricky to adjust at first. The first time I played with it, it took more than half an hour to pull apart and re-put it back together in some sort of ordnance. I do hope the video here will help. As I got finer and I did more lines, it started to look a lot more interesting. Do be careful, as there is no cup, and when you go too fast it will spill everywhere. Cleaning it is very straightforward. You pour whatever paint back into the container or to waste. Wipe out the cup. First time dry, second time with a bit of thinner in it. Spray the remainder of the paint out. Fill with thinner and flush out multiple times until the thinner seems to be absolutely clear. The maintenance regime is very clear and easy to do. Probably after every use, pull it apart and wipe out the interior. Remove any debris that you do notice in front of the nozzle, and occasionally you will want to pull out the needle and give that a bit of a wipe to prevent build-up and clogging. I filled the cup about 5 times, a third of the way up, and by the sticks one it was already clear. So the cleaning process took about less than a minute when done in a speedy fashion. Now, the main reason why I got my hands on one of these airbrushes is for freehand camouflage and lining on very small models. So I've got this tiny Imperial Japanese tank, and what we're going to do is outline our camouflage by painting lines and colouring detail with absolute minimal overspray. And you can see I'm getting a pretty tight effect as I'm going. It's colouring in really well, and I'm able to get all sorts of wonderful patterns, and I just colour in as I go. It's going to give us the most flexible and easygoing camouflage in the game. This alone really makes it worthwhile its price tag and the ease of the maintenance and cleaning up. For an absolute beginner, you can just put paint straight in and you're already spraying lines like this after doing a few on a piece of paper, just as I've done, with the paint correctly thinned. This is a professional instrument. It is going to cost you a lot more, thus being a high end. And what is expected in an airbrush or a complete different experience from the entry level or the budget stuff is purely maintenance, speed of use, and overspray. And we can see from these lines, overspray is definitely not an issue. My trigger discipline does have a bit more practice to go, and for this absolute tiny 70-second tank, the camouflage lines are very fluid. They look fantastic. They're not larger, fatter blobs that I've gotten out of other models. It is an absolute joy to use, and my overall assessment is very worthwhile getting it. A lot of modelers and artists I do highly respect do use this model, but like with anything else, and being a different experience and breakdown, it is going to take some effort and practice to use as a freehand instrument and get the best results out of this airbrush. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until next time, stay tuned for further content, and hit up the comment section for your thoughts, questions, opinions, or your review of the airbrush. Thank you, and catch you guys next time.